Hello and welcome to Earthbeat Visions. This is the first episode in what will be probably quite a lengthy series charting the history of the electronic group The Future Sound of London, as well as solo projects, aliases, covering their entire discography, their transmission and live performance history, and a broad overview and biography of the group in general. The videos in this series will contain information on either an album or a group of singles or EPs, maybe a couple of transmissions, in roughly chronological order. I'll be bunching different bits together to add a sense of narrative continuity, but overall I'll be starting in 1987 and continuing working towards the present day. The majority of this information is already available on my Fractional Difference blog. That's fractionaldifference.wordpress.com for anybody who wants to read ahead. There'll be a few additions and changes which I will have made since I wrote that blog, and I'll be covering releases that are yet to be covered on there. The Future Sound of London is an electronic group consisting of the members Brian Dougans and Garry Cobain. The pair were both born in the 1960s, Brian in 1966 in Glasgow and Garry in 1967 in Bedford. Dougans grew up in a family of creative people. His father was an electronic musician. His father owned one of the very first EMS Synthi AKS modules and worked for the Scottish Film Board, meaning that electronic music was in his blood. His dad had a studio, and from a very young age, he was into unusual and experimental music, including early favourites such as In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson, albums by Tangerine Dream, and like many, he discovered punk in the late 70s and remains a big fan of the Sex Pistols to this day. His very first band were called The Heads when he was a teenager. He played drums and they recorded a series of incredibly scrappy lo-fi demos to cassette. Some of those are available to hear on YouTube. In the early 80s he discovered the post-industrial and post-punk scene, groups like Cabaret Voltaire, Certain Ratio, 23 Skidoo and various others being a big formative influence. He was part of a arts and sound collective in Glasgow called A New Consciousness, as well as recording solo music as Z-Box, although nothing was formally released. In the mid-80s he moved to Manchester to study audio engineering, and this is where he met Garry Cobain. Cobain's childhood in Bedford was very different to Dougans's. He was discouraged from following music by his parents and was mostly into the more indie end of post-punk. Groups like the Chameleons and the Cocteau Twins were particular favourites of his, and that kind of sound informed early bands he was in, such as Exhibition, who played locally. He was usually the singer in the bands, but none of these ever achieved much in the way of success. Similarly to Brian, he moved to Manchester to study, although his electronics degree was not audio-focused enough for him. He chose Manchester because it was home of bands like Joy Division and the Smiths, who were huge influences on his formative music taste. The two met working in a nightclub, Cobain notoriously being told not to bullshit Brian, and immediately went out and bullshitted him, which feels very Garry Cobain-esque. Eventually the two struck up a friendship, and through a shared love of some groups like Cabaret Voltaire, started creating music together. Garry was very impressed by Brian's knowledge of electronics and was a fan of the music he was making, and this was a doorway to the world of electronic music for him. The first ever FSOL-related release was Bacteria from a Baboon's Stomach, released under the name Twitch. It is by far the most obscure release in the vast FSOL-related catalogue, so obscure in fact that nobody seems to have heard it. Still, there's no harm in some baseless speculation. What we do know about the album is limited. The group Twitch consisted of Dougans, Cobain and Scottish bassist Ian MacArthur, who had studied with Brian. They recorded with one album and released it on their own cassette imprint Floor Music. Copies were sold through the esteemed Eastern Bloc record shop in Manchester, and 20 to 30 copies are believed to have been made. In an interview about the DIY music scene in Manchester, Dougans explained that they were planning on releasing other artists on Floor Music. "We're giving people a chance to put their music out." The album itself is referred to as a 7-song sampler of everything they were working on at the time, described as varied by the interviewer and "there's something for everyone" by Brian. In terms of music, we know one song from the album, Sunshine and Brick. The song ended up on the Humanoid album Global and probably gives some idea of the album's sound. It's somewhat industrial inspired, with Brian providing electronics and Gaz singing.
Psychotic.
Brian has cited indie dance groups like The Beloved as operating in a similar area. Another song on the album was called Tall Buildings. An overview of the era was given in a 1994 Mixmag interview, which describes the funding and the music thus. Soon Cobain got fed up with sitting on the bed in Dougans' bedroom directing the action. He wanted to get involved in the technical process. Sacking university, he went on the Enterprise Allowance scheme and set up his own studio. This was pre-88 and they didn't have a clue what they were doing. They came up with the weirdest stuff. Garry goes on to simply describe the music as stuff that was really strange. I couldn't work out whether it was good or bad. And that's the extent of our knowledge. It's slightly unusual that no copies have ever appeared online. Although it's likely that many DIY tapes from this era ended up in bins, there must be someone out there with a tape who could digitise and upload it. Until that happens, however, the album remains unknown to FSOL fans. No track list, not even a cover image, and Brian has suggested that a reissue is unlikely. After the small-scale release of Bacteria from a Baboon's Stomach, Twitch split, marked initially by the departure of Ian MacArthur. At this point, Brian Dougans had started working as a tutor at Salford College, teaching the same audiovisual technology course he had studied there before. I took the course myself and they asked me to stay on as a tutor afterwards. We use a 16-track with a Soundcraft desk and 2 video edit suites, 1 VHS and 1 U-Matic, he said in an interview. It was through this course and its contacts that Dougans met the video company Stakker Communications, and most notably its employees Mark McLean and Colin Scott. The arrival of Acid House in the UK around the same time led the team working together on a number of audiovisual products, including TV idents from MTV.
Positive electron. Positive electron.
The acid house sound, which was growing incredibly popular in Manchester, the heart of the UK's dance scene in the late 80s. In London, they're backwards, according to Brian at the time. And Stakker's cutting-edge graphics were a potent mix. And when Dougans sent a video to Morgan Khan, the owner of influential house label Street Sounds, a session was booked almost immediately. Dougans had been working on a number of acid house tracks, somewhat more lo-fi in sound than Stakker Humanoid, and it was undoubtedly these that were sent to Khan. However, recorded with friend and studio engineer John Laker over 2 days at Khan's studio Dance Music, Stakker Humanoid featured a much more polished sound than many of these earlier Humanoid sessions. Originally released as a white label 12-inch to promote the Acido Amingo compilation it first featured on, club and radio DJs immediately picked up on its insistent UK acid sound, which owed as much to UK punk as US house according to Dougans, and a wide-scale release was immediately on the cards. Released as a single on Khan's new West Side imprint, the track became one of the first crossover acid house tracks in the UK, reaching number 17 in the singles top 40, leading to a Top of the Pops performance and launching the career of Dougans and, vicariously, Cobain. While Garry was not present on the record itself, His friendship with Brian remained, and he was on board for the accompanying Humanoid album. The success of the single was partially down to some unexpected championing from pop DJs Bruno Brooks and Pete Waterman. Brooks was especially vocal about the track, recommending it in Teen Music Mag #1 and playing it on his primetime Radio 1 show. Waterman's dance music programme Hitman and Her provided the first UK TV performance of the track, complete with choreographed dancers. Another piece of good fortune came with the frenetic music video, created of course by Stakker Communications, being played on BBC Music show Behind the Beat immediately after the UK premiere of Michael Jackson's Smooth Criminal. We had several million people watching suddenly and their heads vibrating, and that was it, explained Dougans to The Guardian in 2013. The next week it was in the charts. The Top of the Pops performance found Brian stood behind a rack of gear and a computer, having to mime to the sampled vocals, while friend and longtime collaborator John Goslin mimed bass. Dougans was stopping at Goslin's squat in London after the performance and brought him along to make up the numbers. The success of the track encouraged Brian to give up his fledgling career as a studio engineer and focus more on music. The Humanoid project may have fallen apart through legal troubles over the following year, but Stakker Humanoid remains one of the key moments in the FSOL story for setting Brian off on a journey and taking Garry with him. The release itself came out as a 12-inch, with the original mix, a radio edit and an extended version, complete with atmospheric pads and samples called the Omen Mix. 7-inch and CD editions were also released, including a second part of the track consisting of the atmospheric sections of the Omen Mix alone. West Side carried the record in the UK with international distribution handled by ZYX in Germany, Possum in Australia, Max Music in Spain, Beatbox in Sweden, On the Beat in France, and in Japan, Alpha, who released it as a 3-inch CD with exclusive artwork. As is the case with popular dance tracks, Stakker Humanoid has been reissued numerous times, most notably on Jumpin' and Pumpin' in 1992, backed with a plethora of FSOL remixes, as well as in 2001 and 2007, while re-recordings of the track have come out in 2018 and 2020. The track was also released on the Humanoid album Global in 1989 under the name Humanoid. With each release in this series, I'll be looking at the overview of the release itself, as well as briefly at the individual tracks. Humanoid, Stakker Humanoid. Everyone has musical landmarks. The first record they bought, the first gig they attended, the first time they heard their favourite song. For a certain generation of people, there was another, the first song they downloaded. I downloaded Napster in late 2000 before it became the music industry's public enemy #1, when downloading was still very much a novelty. The idea of being able to go online and get a piece of music for free was just about the most exciting thing imaginable, especially when your tastes were too diverse for your income to meet. Having discovered the wealth of Dougans' Cobain material out there when I got online, it was unsurprising that the first track I decided to download was one of theirs. Quite why I chose Stakker Humanoid I can't remember, but it's possible it's because it came first in the discography. I hadn't really considered that it was a Brian solo track, but that felt irrelevant. To me, this was a new FSOL track, the first I'd heard in a couple of years, which is a long time when you're a teenager. It took 2 hours to download, which seems incomprehensible in the day and age when you can download a lossless album in a matter of minutes, but it was absolutely worth it. I immediately loved the track. I had no context of its importance in the history of British dance music, it was simply this brilliant driving piece of electronic music. By the time I'd downloaded it was probably time for bed, but I played it a few times in a row before turning the computer off. In the following months I'd go on to download every early FSOL track I could. Some proved incredibly difficult to track down, but none hit me in quite the same way Stakker Humanoid did that first time. Enough has been written about the track over the years, it doesn't really need these plaudits from me. The fact that it and dozens of its remixes have appeared on more than 100 compilations over the years and continue to this day is testament to its influence. But the details of the track often get overlooked, however, in context of the track's importance, especially as the construction of the piece is quite intriguing. An interview in I Am and RW from February 1989 discusses the making of Stakker Humanoid and notes that it's structured in 3 parts, and recording started with the final acid section, which acts as a climax to the track. It's hard to pinpoint the exact split between the 2 acid sections. At some point there's a cut, punctuated by a vocal sample, but on repeat listens I can't place it. Nevertheless, the opening organ-led section is definitely distinct and gives the track a somewhat atmospheric intro that sets it apart from some of the more monotonous sounding pieces of dance music around at the time. The final track was cut together physically by splicing the master tape, a practice not uncommon at the time, and a technique Dougans would take forward into FSOL's first collaging process in the early 90s. The splicing is most obvious in the Omen mix, although more about that track coming up in a few minutes. Another later FSOL sample is the use of Akai samplers, which were loaded with 808 and 909 sounds to provide the bulk of the rhythm for the track. It's a slightly roundabout way of doing it, but combined with John Laker's well kitted out studio, it elevates Stakker Humanoid above the rawer and simpler acid sound of the Humanoid Sessions material from the same era. The gear used on the track is surprisingly extensive. The interview lists a Yamaha RX-5, DX7 and TX81Z, Casio CZ101, Roland JX3P, Alpha Juno 1 and D550, and an Oberheim DPX alongside the Akai S900 and 303. Gearheads will want to check that interview out for detailed information about the effects units, mixer, monitor and other studio gear also used in the recording of the track. I've popped a link down below for you. One of the most famous elements of the track is the use of distorted vocal samples. Humanoid and Intruder Alert both coming from the arcade computer game Berserk, which Dougans recorded with a handheld tape recorder. Ultimately, it's no surprise that Stakker Humanoid has been remixed countless times, reissued almost as many, re-recorded by Brian more than once and remains a hugely influential track to this day. Loved by everyone from Richard D. James to Noel Gallagher, it's an outright classic. Every good dance track needs a radio edit, and Stakker Humanoid was the first in the FSOL canon. The original track runs to less than 5 minutes, which is hardly an epic, but nevertheless this edit was cut to catch the casual listener's ear and help the track on its journey up the charts. The bulk of the structure remains, with the opening organ section, a lighter acid movement and the final acid screech, and it almost works as a piece in its own right. Sadly, it lacks the most intense moments in the final movement, which gives it a slightly anticlimactic feel. Still, as the version of the track most listeners will have heard at the time, and the mix both seen on the music video and the classic Top of the Pops performance, it's earned its place in history. What looks like a straightforward extended mix of the track is anything but. The original 5-minute mix of the track is the perfect runtime for a track of its nature, but thankfully the additional 3 minutes here are all original. Yes, this is the Omen mix, which is described in that 1989 article as featuring some unusually atmospheric sampling, which describes it perfectly. There are choir samples, no doubt inspiring the Omen name, as well as melodic synth stabs and pads. Elsewhere, the organ riff is filtered to become a twinkling synth line. There's even a weird moment with some odd vocal samples, which foreshadows the sample work of FSOL's more head-spinning moments. Once one of these new sections has run its course, it slams back into the original acid sections again. Being the sucker for melody that I am, it remains my favourite version of the track. Taking up the second side of the original 12-inch, plus a spot on the CD single, the Omen mix has since found its way onto the 1992 reissue. The exclusive sections of this track are edited together to form the Part 2 on the 1988 7-inch and CD. This was later reissued under the name The Extra Mix. Humanoid John Peel Session, 28th of November 1988. There's an oft-quoted line about FSOL not being a band but a broadcast system, notably mentioned in interviews with The Guardian and Radioactive in 1994. It's clear that for Brian and Garry, radio and ISDN is just as important as CD and vinyl. And so I'll be covering every transmission, radio session and, to an extent, live performance in the same detail as the official releases. Shortly after the success of the Stakker Humanoid single, Humanoid was invited to record a radio session for the legendary John Peel show on BBC One. Peel was famed for championing new music of all kinds, having introduced British listeners to the likes of Tangerine Dream, as well as being an early champion of punk, and going on to keep up with the various strands of new electronic music up to his untimely death in 2004. It's no surprise that Stakker went down well with him. Humanoid recorded 3 tracks for the Peel show on the 15th of November 1988, which were broadcast just shy of 2 weeks later on the 28th. The session didn't go quite as smoothly as Dougans and Laker would have liked. This was 1988, dance music was still largely an unknown quantity. The producer and engineering team weren't versed in electronic music, apparently confusing acid rock and acid house and expecting a heavy metal band called Stakker. and being used to live bands at the time went on to coat the drums in reverb, as was the style. Thankfully, Humanoid were allowed to guide a second mix, and the 3 tracks came out pretty well. The material recorded for the session was all exclusive. Opener, Orbital, Feeling appears in no other form elsewhere, while early versions of Slam and Jetstream Tokyo differ somewhat from their final studio mixes. All 3 tracks are still distinctly acid house, but are more mellow and melodic than Stakker Humanoid. With the label interference that led to the somewhat disastrous Global album, the John Peel session is an important document in that it gives an idea of what a proper Humanoid album from 1989 might have sounded like. We'll never really know, but these 3 tracks certainly give the impression of a lost classic. The session was bootlegged and widely available from fan FTPs such as Disenchanted in the 2000s, and in 2007 it received an official release on Your Body Robotic. Of the 3 tracks recorded for the Humanoid Peel session in November '88, Orbital, Feeling, is the most interesting because there's no known studio version of the track. As such, the song remained officially unreleased, despite wide circulation of a Peel session bootleg, until that 2007 release of Your Body Robotic. The track opens in a fairly similar way to Stakker Humanoid, all Roland drum machine samples, but quickly heads into very different territory. Female vocals, wordless oohs and ahs, as well as laughter samples, guide the piece into a much softer, almost soulful world, matched by synth pads and a more restrained 303 line. Hushed spoken word adds to the nocturnal mood. There are occasional tracks from the early era of FSOL with a similar vibe, the likes of I Can See for Miles and maybe So This Is Love. But on the whole, tracks focus on atmosphere, texture, and what Cobain will go on to refer to as euphoric sadness, make it the closest thing to FSOL that would be recorded under the Humanoid banner in this era. It's really quite a wonderful track and has been one of my favourite pre-Virgin pieces in the Dougans Cobain oeuvre since I first heard it. Whether a studio version would ever have emerged remains unknown. Whatever Dougans and Laker had planned for Global never came close to completion. However, it certainly suggests that there was a potentially great Humanoid album on the cards had there been no label interference. Obviously the collapse of Humanoid allowed Brian to reconvene with Garry and start Earthbeat, but it's hard not to be at least somewhat wistful about the possibility of a Humanoid album that featured material of this quality rather than tracks like Dream and The Deep. If any track highlights the difficulty that took place during the recording of Global, it's the version of Slam recorded for the Peel session. The bass line's the same and the synth string pads are present, albeit much higher in the mix, but pretty much everything else from the final version is missing. It's impossible to say how the final studio version of the track would have sounded if it was left up to Dougans and Laker. What we hear here is probably little more than a demo, as Brian states in the February 1989 interview that they were still then only working on the second single. But it's clear from the melodic synths that dominate the second half of the Peel session version that Slam started life as a far superior track to the awful vocal-led single version released later that year. Although much darker and more dramatic sounding, the overall vibe of the track is similar to the melancholic, melodic Orbital Feeling from the same session. Dougans describes the second single in that interview as featuring the same sort of acid burn as Stakker Humanoid, but it's more mellow, and that certainly does a good job of describing what's present here, with a particularly squelchy 303 line coming in prominently in the second half. As with Orbital Feeling, I've always loved this version of Slam. It has a character of its own, and although the whispered techno vocal sample dates it somewhat, overall the melodic acid sound works brilliantly to this day. As with the other two tracks, it was released on Your Body Robotic in 2007, which was a blessing, giving us a high quality copy of this wonderful obscurity. Of the three tracks recorded for the Peel session, Jetstream Tokyo is the most conventional. Once again, a Stakker Humanoid style drum machine intro is present, leading into a 303 line. Unlike Orbital and Slam, Jetstream Tokyo is a straightforward acid house jam. At 6.5 minutes, it could be argued that it outstays its welcome a little, especially in comparison to the studio version finally released in 2003. That said, it's a welcome piece in its own right, being one of only 3 straight-up acid tracks created by the Dougans Laker version of Humanoid that have been released. The studio version was shortlisted for inclusion on Global at one point, before Dougans had departed from the project and Westside had taken complete control. There is one live gig known from this era, Live Acid at Riverside in Hyde, December 1988. Live Acid by Stakker in Hyde, a town in Greater Manchester. The flyer appears in the Ramblings of a Madman Volume 3 book, and it's the only known information about the show. It kind of matches a description of a story from the old EBV website, however, in which Garry joined Brian on stage at a gig on the outskirts of Manchester in a little town whose livelihood came from grinding bones into glue. Garry said at one point the 303 I was aimlessly wanking fell off its stand, sending batteries rolling across the stage. The use of aimlessly wanking and the description of it as a PA suggests it probably wasn't a conventional gig and might even have involved miming. Although it does say Live Acid, it's certainly possible that further similar shows took place at the time. Humanoid Slam. The Stakker Humanoid single was a massive success. A follow-up single was pretty much guaranteed. To quote Dougans again, the track would feature the same sort of acid burn as Stakker Humanoid but more mellow. And this much is certainly true of Slam, a track that features the same roll and drum samples and 303 bass sounds as its more successful cousin. However, by the time the track was released in April '89, it had come a long way from the moody version premiered on the Peel show the previous November. Slam is the first example of how Morgan Khan had started to direct the Humanoid project to his own tastes. Khan, of course, was a hugely influential label owner who played a large part in the spread of black dance music in the UK. His love of electro, hip-hop and classic house was clear through the material released on his iconic Street Sounds label. In many ways, Stakker Humanoid was an outlier on Khan's Westside label, and he tried to direct Dougans and Laker towards incorporating the sounds found elsewhere on the label. Thus, Slam features extensive raps by Ben Afodu, who would later become famous as vocalist for Brighton-based house act Fats and Small, and female vocals by Lisa Millett. The single features 4 tracks, the original, which is listed as Club Mix, as was the style for many years, as well as a radio edit, an Afodu-led hip house version, and a track called Bass Invaders, which, despite the title, is effectively another remix of Slam. A music video was tentatively planned. Brian initially suggested he was interested in working on it himself, before handing over the reins to Mark McLean, later known as Boogie G Riphead, who created a lo-fi art prank video that the label were less than satisfied with. Hoping to build on the success of Stakker Humanoid, Slam was once again licensed out to numerous international labels, including Beatbox in Sweden, Max Music in Spain, 5 in Italy and ZYX in Germany, as well as the legendary Trax label in the US. In the UK, chart-friendly CD and 7-inch versions also came out. Surprisingly, the track failed to live up to expectations, only reaching number 54 in the UK charts. Undoubtedly, the stylistic change will have upset some Acid fans, but the vocal house sound was very popular in the UK during 1989, and it seems odd that the track didn't catch on. Either way, it marked a downturn in fortunes for Brian, who continued to work on the Humanoid album with increasing interference from the label. Not long after, he abandoned the project and returned home. It's notable that neither Slam nor the following Humanoid singles feature in any way in the Humanoid section of the 2015 book The Most Important Moments in Our Life. Slam. In contrast to the Peel version, the driving bass line remains, as does the titular vocal sample, while the synth strings have been replaced by an organ sound. 303 lines appear at various points throughout the track, reminding us of Humanoid's acid origins. Overall, the backing track feels like a more heavily developed version of the early Peel version, and it works fine. Unfortunately, the vocals do nothing for the track at all. Ben Afodu's raps are very much at odds with the moodier aspects of the track, while Lisa Millett's soulful tones jar with the acid lines. It doesn't help that, as was the case with a lot of UK house at the time, nobody involved does a very good job of replicating the authentic Chicago sound. Stakker Humanoid worked so well because it was a radical reimagining of the US acid sound, influenced as much by punk and industrial as house. But none of the vocals here have anything to offer that's new or exciting, or really improves or grows on the Chicago house sound, and thus they fall flat. There's an amusing breakdown in the middle in which, over the top of pitched down vocals reciting "yeah, yeah," Afodu repeats "this is Humanoid" and is answered by the same Berserk sample most famously used in Stakker Humanoid. It's really quite daft and strangely meta in a way that FSOL records rarely are. Ultimately, Slam feels like an awkward halfway house that satisfies neither Dougans and Laker's vision of a mellow or acid sound, nor Khan's attempt at pushing them into vocal house territory. There's a decent track buried in there, but the Peel session version is the closest to it we're ever likely to hear. The radio edit of Slam was released on all formats of the single, and it does a good job of condensing the full track into a shorter runtime, albeit one that probably received very little radio airplay. Ben Afodu's raps are given less emphasis, and the acid parts are barely present, with, perhaps unsurprisingly, a focus on Lisa Millett's chorus vocals. The meta Berserk sampling breakdown is included, perhaps to remind listeners that yes, this really is the same act who released Stakker Humanoid 6 months previously. The only Humanoid B-side, Bass Invaders, is effectively a new remix of Slam. Synth sequences, stabs, the Berserk Humanoid sample and the Ben Afodu's vocals are all present from the original track. There are unique drum patterns and synth stabs, but ultimately little of note is added to the track. The most notable aspect is the inclusion of both male and female vocal samples, which are best known for their use in the global track Crybaby. Overall, it feels more like a studio jam than a fully fledged track. It's an interesting curio, but generally an inessential entry to the Humanoid catalogue. The fourth and final track on the Slam single is a hip house version, and unsurprisingly the rap takes the forefront on this mix. The backing track is a slightly different arrangement to the radio edit, but contains no new sounds. By moving focus away from the female vocals and synth pads, the hip house version ends up being the most acid-focused mix of the track, then probably the version that will appeal most to a Stakker Humanoid fan. That's it for this episode of Earthbeat Visions. Next time I'll be taking on the debut Humanoid album, Global, all the controversies around it, as well as the remaining Humanoid singles, compilation tracks and videos from the era. Please do subscribe to my channel, Absent with Concept, and like or comment the video. All interactions help the video be seen more by people. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions on Stakker Humanoid, Slam, the Peel session and Dougans and Laker's version of Humanoid in general, so please leave those comments below. And I'll see you next time.